Hello all, thank you so much for coming. My name is Aidan Kaminer. I am an English major with minors in Spanish and anthropology in the College of Arts and Sciences. My advisor is Dr. Carrie Preston, and I will be assisted today by my good friend Brianna. My project is entitled Hearing What Has Been Told, immigrant fiction focused outside the anglosphere. So my project engages with three fictional narratives, in this case novels, which present stories of migration which are written in English but decenter Western narratives and English-speaking countries. As you can see, the world is rather vast. We are here. This is the United States of America. Even having grown up in an immigrant family, I, having grown up in the northeast of the United States, was exposed to all of these sort of cultural and social norms and experiences of an American. As a result of this, I grew up sort of with this odd understanding that's pushed by notions such as the American dream and ideas of America as a nation of immigrants, that immigration is sort of the story of embattled aliens having difficulty abroad and then coming here, and that the United States is the natural and even inevitable conclusion of any migratory journey. Having studied forced displacement at Boston University, I know that this is not the case. In fact, the United States and the Anglosphere as a whole, usually identified as the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, or the parts of the world where English is the official and predominantly spoken language, are usually, if not almost always, centered in stories of migration that are presented to us in the United States. This is due to all sorts of sociological factors which present America as the center of the world, and my project sort of seeks to push back against that. I read a story freshman year, which some of you may be familiar with, that centers here in what is traditionally Korea and Japan. The book was Pachinko by Min Jin Lee, a masterpiece, beautiful novel which details the 5-generation-long epic of a Korean family that immigrates to Japan at the beginning of the 20th century and then has to deal with all of the struggles of both living in Japan in the 20th century and living in Japan while being ethnically Korean. This book was brilliant, and it completely inspired me and changed my career trajectory. But what shocked me is that this beautiful narrative about the Korean-Japanese experience was the first novel ever written in English to talk about Korean-Japanese people. It was published in 2017. This was shocking to me because having now learned about it, I know what an incredible, fascinating, horrifying, beautiful, rich history it is. So I wondered if perhaps there were other stories, other novels that have already been told, that are out there, that may not have received the same readership and attention as novels and stories that center the US experience because of sociological factors we discussed earlier. I decided to look for other books like Pachinko and slowly started to rule them out based on a series of factors. I wanted books that were decentering the United States and Anglosphere. I wanted books that were originally written in English so that readers could experience them in their original language and show that these kinds of stories are accessible in their original content. And that left me ultimately with only 3 books. I ended up settling on 3 that I felt fit the theme of the project, which were Pachinko, the book that started it all, Mornings in Jenin, which centers on the Palestinian diaspora, and The Old Drift, which saunters all around the world, but is centered mainly in the nations of Zambia and Zimbabwe. These books all share this sort of ethos of showcasing migratory stories that decenter Western experiences, and I wanted to learn more about them. I decided my project would be threefold. The first step would be to learn the historical context behind each of these stories. I wanted to be able to engage with the material in a way that was intentional and educated so I could get some of the smaller references and know what was going on. The next step was to read the books and engage with them. I wanted to note the similarities between them, the differences, how different kinds of overarching themes were told differently or similarly in these incredible novels that all sort of share a similar ethos in very different ways. And the final project that I did for this project was to write a creative response. As I mentioned earlier, I come from an immigrant family. My grandfather was a refugee from Poland. My father is an immigrant from the Middle East. And migration and displacement have profoundly shaped who I am. I wanted to engage with these materials in a way that sort of combines the beauty of these novels, the historical context with which they engage, and my own family's experience with migration. I ended up creating a series of 3 creative nonfiction pieces. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, creative nonfiction is a wonderful, underrated genre and sort of medium of writing, which could be described as the no man's land, or if you're kinder, maybe the love child, or the happy medium, between poetry and prose. It tells truthful narratives in ways that still engage with creative language and sort of rejects the boundary or the border between poetry and prose. Here, you have an example from the creative piece which I wrote in response to pachinko. The sort of overall piece is framed by a recipe for kimchi, which is a traditional Korean food, often called the national dish of Korea, which is ubiquitous with sort of Korean diaspora in a sense. I used sections of the recipe interspersed with sort of reflections on the history of Korea, the history of kimchi, the history of the Korean Japanese, my own family's migration, and all sorts of different historical facets. So here we have one step. Step 7, which has to do with division, cutting the pieces apart. And here's one piece of sort of my response to it, in which I used both sort of prose and poetry, rejecting intentionally the sort of boundary between the two to try to respond to the thought. Here you can see I flow without any sort of transition or border between prose at the top into the poem in the middle, and then back down into prose on the bottom. The poetry, if you have far too much time on your hands to read this, you might notice, the first 3 lines are an inverted haiku, which is a traditional form of Japanese poetry that typically has 5 syllables, a line with 7 syllables, and another line with 5. This has 7, 5, 7 in the first 3. So I tried to invert this tradition and combine it with what is actually, with all the 6 lines together, a traditional Korean form of poetry known as the shijo. So here, in the first 3 lines, I sort of reject and also allude to a traditional Japanese haiku by Basho, often considered sort of the greatest haiku poet. And in the last 3 lines, I allude to a traditional Korean shijo, trying to unite the two in a way that shows sort of the arbitrariness of the border between them and how they can be combined in a way that is beautiful and maybe a little confusing, but necessary. So these are just some of the examples of what I did in this piece to try to tell a story in a way that rejects or transcends borders, but still creates a sense of understanding and belonging. I wanted to use creative nonfiction specifically because it rejects borders. And as the sort of no man's land, I felt was a fitting medium to tell a story that tries and attempts and hopes to be transnational in a way. Thank you. I want to thank Dr. Carrie Preston, my advisor, for all of her work and for recommending some of the books I read. The Kilachand Honors College, the English Department, the Initiative on Forced Displacement, and 2 of my best friends, Armand Chaudhry and Salmang Wen, who were very influential in this project, and Minjin Lee for giving an amazing talk 3 years ago that changed my life and inspired this project. And I want to thank you all for coming today. And also Bree for helping me advance the slides.
Questions from the audience?
Yes.
Can you talk about narrowing down books?
Sure. Hi, Susan.
Narrowing down the books to the last 3, but what was your initial criteria to find those initial 7 or so books that you found?
Yes, so those are, all of the books that I presented are books which deal with migration in some way. They're all books that I would love to read. So they're all books that I considered at one point for the project. The criteria were basically that I wanted it to be originally written in English, I wanted it to be a story of migration, and I wanted the books to, even if they mentioned or dealt with countries in the anglosphere like the US or the UK, to sort of have those not at the center and to decenter those experiences. Very last minute, I had to switch out books, actually, in the course of the project upon realizing that they didn't really fit the ethos of what I was trying to do. So a lot of the things that faded away very suddenly for me. And as you might remember, some of the books that faded away there were actually books I said I planned to read when I presented this project last semester in our Kilachand class. So I wanted books that, even if they didn't necessarily perfectly exclude the West and the Anglosphere, decentered it and centered the experiences of the immigrants that fall outside those traditional categories.
Oh, is there a place we can read your creative nonfiction?
I forgot to mention that, yes. Yes, I was a little silly and forgot to put up a QR code, but once the video is published of this presentation, I will try to distribute and link a PDF which will have both the creative nonfiction responses and also sort of a research summary for each of the stories so that you can maybe pick out some of the historical details and learn a little bit about the historical context. Because one thing I really wanted to do with this project was highlight these narratives, which are already being told but don't receive as wide readership, and these incredible stories. So soon there will be.
So you talked a lot about how do you think it can be applied to in the creative genre, like for creators or novelists specifically? What do you think they can do to make this better?
Yes. Well, the thing is, a lot of migration narratives, specifically one book that was up there is The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen, an incredible book that I plan to read someday. The thing is, it's almost natural and very understandable that a lot of the stories published in English, particularly published in the US, would center the US because they're often the narratives that the author themselves can relate to or talk about their family history. If I were to write a book about migration, it may very well end in the US, which is where my family's migration story has taken me now. So I can't tell authors what not to write about, but I would love to see stories like The Old Drift and like Pachinko receive wider readership. And I would love for people to know that they can write these stories and still receive critical acclaim and financial success. One thing sort of stylistically is I think that genres are silly. I think we should reject borders in many ways. And I think sort of trying to pigeonhole something into poetry or prose or a novel or a novella or a series of short essays is pointless as long as you're telling a beautiful and necessary story.
Hey, I'm over here. I just wanted to say I love your project. I think you're incredible. And I wanted to know, because you mentioned that you are from an immigrant family, did you find yourself getting emotional while working on this project? And which book did you like the most?
Very good questions. Yes, this project was really personal to me. I was emotional in many different ways. At some points, I wasn't even sure if I should do this project, if the entire endeavor was just me being a white savior. I definitely decided that it wasn't because I did it. But there were a lot of things that really spoke to my own family's experience, and I try to bring that out in the pieces. For example, in the piece I wrote in response to Pachinko, the sort of central metaphor is kimchi and fermentation, and how things are impermanent and change, and how that's beautiful and necessary to accept. And I spoke about a time, my grandfather was Israeli, he died about 10 years ago. My grandmother I never met because she died about 30 years ago, right before my father moved to the US. And right after she died, my grandfather's trauma response was that he started pickling everything in the kitchen. The entire house was just filled with jars of pickling things, which is kind of a beautiful metaphor that he came up with himself. And so talking and thinking about fermentation and kimchi actually helped me learn a lot about my own family's history, because I didn't even know that story until I talked with my dad about the project, and he told me that. My favorite book was definitely Pachinko. Please read it. It's really good. Thank you so much.